Okay, good morning, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for making the time to virtually be with us today. My name is Raymond Karam, and I'm the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. This webinar today is part of a monthly series launched earlier this year and available only to our supporters and close friends, where AGSIW scholars and affiliated experts share their work and insights on the most salient issues facing the Gulf and U.S. policy in the region. With news of King Salman's ill health and the upcoming presidential election in the United States, the next few months could shape the trajectory of U.S. Saudi relations for years to come. So we felt it imperative to tackle this topic this time around. And we're delighted to be joined by two of the foremost experts on these topics, Professor F. Gregory Gause III, a member of the Board of Directors of AGSIW, the John H. Lindsay Chair, Professor of International Affairs and Head of the International Affairs Department at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and Kristin Diwan, Senior Resident Scholar at AGSIW, where her current projects concern generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the countries of the GCC. The conversation today will be moderated by AGSIW President Ambassador Douglas Silliman. But before we start, I want to remind everyone that the conversation today is on the record. It is being recorded and will be available on our website in a day or so. The second half of the hour today will be dedicated to your questions, which you can either submit via the Q&A function on the Zoom dashboard, or for a more intimate feel, you can raise your hand and we will briefly enable your video and audio functions so you can ask your question in person. Thank you all again for being with us. And with that, Ambassador Silliman, over to you.
Raymond, thank you very much for getting us started, and welcome to all of our guests today for what I hope will be a very, very interesting program. President Trump has invested a great deal of energy to develop the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia during his time in office. And despite these efforts, or perhaps because of them, in Washington, American policy toward Saudi Arabia has become partisan and polarized, with Republicans supporting Saudi Arabia as a country that is fighting terrorism and pushing back against Iranian adventurism, and Democrats focusing on civilian casualties in the conflict in Yemen and criticizing the government's treatment of dissident voices, especially Jamal Khashoggi. With American elections on November 3rd, the next few months could shape the trajectory of U.S.-Saudi relations for a long time to come. This debate in Washington, however, seemed very foreign to me when I visited Riyadh this past February. I was struck by the energy, the construction of infrastructure, and a sense of positive change in the air. The young Saudis with whom I spoke praised the reforms of Mohammed bin Salman, particularly the move away from religious tenets as the driver of life, conduct, and government policy. And interestingly to me, so did the vast majority of older Saudis with whom I met. So we've got two real good experts today to help us unravel the contradictions that drive U.S.-Saudi relations. And I want to start, Greg, with you, if you don't mind. Could you describe for us your thoughts on the status of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and particularly in view of President Trump's attempts to tighten relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia, counterposed against increased congressional scrutiny of Riyadh's policies, both foreign and domestic?
So, Doug, I think that there's three things that have changed in the U.S. that mean that the U.S.-Saudi relationship is going to be restructured as we go forward. I don't think a Biden presidency is going to make a 180-degree change on Saudi Arabia, but any Democratic administration, given the way the Democrats have started to look at Saudi Arabia, it means it's going to be different than the strong embrace and the personal connection that President Trump has developed. So you put your finger on one of those changes, which is partisanship, right? Everything in the U.S. is more partisan now. In the past, U.S.-Saudi relations was bipartisan. Nobody in Congress really liked the Saudis, Republicans or Democrats for that matter. But everyone in the White House, Republicans or Democrats, wanted to have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think that might be changing, particularly in the younger ranks of the Democratic Party. And I think that's a factor of two other things that are changing on our side. one of which is Middle East fatigue, right? And that's real. And I think it's been expressed in both parties, including by President Trump. I mean, we have to acknowledge the fact that in the last 3 presidential elections, the winner of that election was the more dovish candidate on the Middle East, the candidate who promised to get us out of the Middle East. So there's real Middle East fatigue. And the third thing I think is a belief, which I think is exaggerated, that Middle East oil is not that important for American interests anymore because we are quote unquote energy independent. Again, I think that's an extremely problematic assertion, but I think it's much more widely held than it was before. And the big change on the Saudi side is decision-making in Saudi, which used to be done largely by committee and thus was cautious, and now is in the hands of 2 people, basically 1 person most of the time. And that 1 person, the Crown Prince, is much more of a risk taker, much more willing to push the boundaries of what was in the past a much more cautious Saudi approach to foreign policy. And I think that those are the 4 things that are going to make the U.S.-Saudi relationship a bit rockier going forward. Again, not a 180-degree shift, but I think that it's going to be not nearly as close in a Democratic administration as it has been in the Trump administration.
Right. Thanks, Greg. Kristin, when I was in Riyadh in February, I visited the new Ministry of Culture, and I was surprised because I felt like I was somewhere in the San Francisco Bay Area in a tech company. It was full of young, vibrant Saudis who earnestly told me that they hoped to identify a genuine Saudi national culture and cultivate young Saudis to develop the culture. The discussions were completely secular, and they seemed to be going along with the lessening of the public role of Islam in governance and the focus on Saudi Arabia as a nation. So how do you see the development of Saudi nationalism and the role of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his policies in promoting it?
Thanks, Doug. I'm glad you started with that kind of anecdote talking about young Saudis, because I think this issue of generational change is so important in the kingdom. When I started going there back in 2011, and I mentioned 2011 for a reason, I was amazed to find in Saudi Arabia art salons, YouTube comedy collectives, new publishing houses, volunteer groups, and even some kind of proto-political groups that were coordinating with young Gulfies across the Gulf, across several different states. And all of these were organized by young Saudis from the grassroots. And it was just like there was a new Saudi society being formed there online and somehow kind of a little bit out of view. And I think it was exactly this young demographic that MBS sought from the beginning when he came to power, or I mean, very early when he came to power, even in 2015, to really capture and then to leverage by seizing on this new nationalism, which was already a little bit under play as well, but not to the extent that it was when he came to power, to really reshape the country. And the reason I make that point is just, I think we tend to associate all these changes that are happening in Saudi Arabia with MBS, and I think that's natural because he is kind of the main, factor driving these things. But I think it's important to recognize that there were really, really fundamental shifts that were happening in the kingdom even before he came to power. This generational shift is one of them that was already starting to really impact Saudi society. You had, of course, the generational transition that was happening within the ruling family, which was inevitable, right? Just by biology, you were going to end up having a generational shift. And I would argue as well that was almost inevitable that was going to lead to more conflict or a more conflictual relationship within the ruling family. Something that Greg, I'm sure, would talk about is, of course, the geopolitical shifts in the context where this was taking place, where, as we said, the U.S. showing a little bit less commitment to play an absolute overwhelming role of this security umbrella. And of course, the collapse of these other states around them that were taking place at the same time. And, some real shifts in the oil market, which for, the U.S., there's some changes, but for Saudi Arabia, this is still really their lifeblood. So I bring up all those things just to say that, there were a lot of really structural reasons why Saudi Arabia was going to have to change in this period, and there are deeper shifts, I think, beyond one personality, and then we can talk about that personality as well. But I think fundamentally, once we look at these shifts and put them in combination with the character of MBS, who was obviously has been very decisive, and that is his watchword. We can talk about impetuous as well, which is the word that we like to use in Washington. I mean, I'll let you hear a lot more. But I think it definitely does mean that we're looking at a really substantively different Saudi state right now. It's more connected, just as you said, to the population through nationalism instead of Islamism. And what's really important there is that it's now actively mobilizing the population in ways that we didn't see before. I mean, usually monarchies like to demobilize their populations, right? But now this is one where they're actively having to mobilize the population to get involved in the economy, even to some degree in their foreign policy debates. And as Greg mentioned, of course, we have the centralization now of rule in one line of the ruling family, so much more centralized, and a consolidation of power too within the royal court, and a formation of a lot of new sort of national institutions there where they were once kind of more dispersed. So I think we have to think about the Saudi state really differently. It's going to act a bit differently than what we expect traditionally from a Saudi state to act, and we're already seeing a lot of that. And I would argue in some ways it's going to look a little bit more like the Arab republics. So we have to weigh a lot of those things when we think about how Saudi Arabia is going to act as an actor in the region. And we could talk about a lot of examples, where that has really come about. I mean, we could think of a lot of things that have happened where people are like, wow, I can't believe Saudi Arabia is acting that way. And the point I want to make, if we're talking about like what happened with Canada, if you remember the reaction there. If you talk about recently, the oil debate happened, was really interesting, the way they played their cards in the last oil crisis in this pandemic era. And a lot of these things are just giving us a sign of this new Saudi state that really is emerging, and I think we have to take into account in these relations.
Greg, let me go back to something that you said in your introductory statement. That the United States seems to be overemphasizing the importance of the idea of energy independence and the way that changes the conceptualization of relations with the Gulf. I kind of want to flip that over and get your thoughts on how do the Saudis see their role in the world? Their oil markets are moving very much to Asia. The Chinese and others are trying to take over some of the commercial role that the United States and Europe have played in the Gulf in the past. But they still seem to think of the United States as their first security provider, and there doesn't seem to be much inclination from China or other big customers in the East to put the resources into a blue water navy necessary to secure the Gulf, the thing that the United States has been doing mostly since the end of World War II. So how do you think Saudi Arabia puts itself and sees itself in the region and in the world, given the shifts in global power and their oil markets?
So I think that there's perceptions and then there's reality. I think that the Saudi elites perceive that the United States is abandoning them. Even though they still see the United States as their most important partner, when I go to Riyadh, I'm bombarded with accusations and questions about the United States abandoning the region and abandoning Saudi Arabia. And my response is always, has the Fifth Fleet left Bahrain? Has Al Udeid Air Base closed up? Are there still 10,000 American troops in Camp Arifjan in Kuwait? I said, when those things happen, then we can talk about the U.S. abandoning. And so I think that there's this kind of strange combination of the new leadership and the Crown Prince wanting to play a much more aggressive and direct role in regional politics and kind of be seen as the equal of the great powers, certainly be seen as the equal of Iran. And some of that leads him into I think, problematic decisions. Right? He sees the Russians, he sees the Iranians killing dissidents abroad, and he says, well, why can't we? But also, I think that there's a real desire in Saudi Arabia to see China play a greater role in the region. I think that they would very much like the Chinese to play a much more political role. I think it's the Chinese who are reluctant to do that. And I think for pretty good reasons. I always thought that the future of Chinese policy in the Middle East is going to be determined by whether the Chinese think like economists or think like political scientists. And if they think like economists, they'll free ride, right? And they'll say, as long as the energy's coming out of there, why do we have to get involved in the politics of this crazy region? But if they think like political scientists, they'll say, boy, we have so many important economic interests there, we'd better get some political and military assets to play over there. And I just don't know which way the Chinese are going to go. I think you're muted, Doug.
You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. I want to ask you the same question, Kristin, from a little different perspective. How do Saudis themselves see their role in the world? I was surprised in February that relatively few Saudis, except at the Diplomatic Institute, mentioned anything with regard to foreign policy or discussed it with me. It was mostly about reforms, new culture, women driving, all the sort of the social issues that have had a big impact in Saudi Arabia. But how are these developments affecting the way Saudis see themselves in the world?
Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, if you think about the social changes that they're trying to take right now, and those social changes are weighted in a real political shift, right? Those are enormous, enormous changes. And they're not only in these initial stage changes, which were to engage society in a very different way, to really change the public sphere so that you could have women more engaged and more involved in the economy, especially, but also as part of that shift from kind of an Islamism to a nationalism. All of these things as well to try to get young people, they have to start contributing more to the economy, right? So they have to find a way to basically have this population not just relying, getting the jobs within the public sector, but to try to innovate. And, they talk a lot about, like all the Gulf states do, about relying much more on this kind of information environment and that kind of thing to drive, the diversification that we know all of these states need. Of course, in Saudi Arabia, it was kind of a bigger jump because of the way that the relationship was with Islamism in the country. You did have a little bit, more resistance to a more globalism and an openness. So I think what they're trying to do is really, in some ways, contradictory because they want to prepare the population to be more involved. Saudi Arabia was always globally linked, but kind of in different ways. I think now, if you look at MBS, some of his earliest trips were to the U.S., where he didn't just come to Washington. He went up to New York, and then he went to California, spent a long time up in like Silicon Valley, went to L.A., met with like movie studios. So there was this real desire, I think, for Saudi Arabia to be seen as a big player and to be seen as like a global player in a much more broader field. But it's linked within the same nationalism, which at the same time builds like a lot of these resentments and desires to really, drive things in the significant Saudi way. And I think in some times those two things come into a lot of conflict, right? The desire to be kind of more globally linked and respected, but then at the same time driving a kind of a hard-edged nationalism that has definitely gotten Saudi Arabia in trouble with a lot of kind of the regional partners that they're going to need to invest in the country and to, work with them internationally. So I think there's a lot of tension that's there in those two things that they're trying to accomplish at the same time.
Yeah, Kristin, let me continue with you. Tamara Coffin-Wittes has given us a fairly long question, which I'm going to try and paraphrase. And Tamara, if I get it wrong, please feel free to send another text and we'll change it. But the shift that both of you describe is essentially from a centralized family rule to a more populist approach to ruling Saudi Arabia. Her basic question is, how come we have not seen more pushback from the family or the ruling elites? She didn't say this, or even the religious elites in Saudi Arabia. Is it merely the threat of sort of intimidation from the Crown Prince? And what sorts of things might we see that would indicate that there is growing opposition to the policies that are being implemented now?
I think there's two things. One is that when we look at those pillars that we always thought about Saudi society, kind of this broad ruling family, and as well, especially kind of the Islamic basis of the country in the form of the religious establishment and these independent Islamic networks, the fact is they were really weakening. And I think maybe not everybody was fully aware of that, but when I went and I looked at all these youth movements, when I look at the challenge that the country was having, I mean, at that time, both at the elite level with a very older rulership and as well within the Islamic movements to keep attracting people, it was really interesting. So there was already kind of a shift happening that meant that those elements were a little bit weaker. And then I think if you look at the way that they came to power, they were very, very aware, King Salman and MBS, of who were the most important actors, the ones who had a kind of independent credibility and a leadership role. And it was playing out very much online, which is interesting in Saudi Arabia. That's just how the politics were working out at the time. And they very proactively went after those people and jailed them. So these were like the key figures that could have played a leading role in shaping public opinion. And this is both within the Islamic activism kind of sector, which is a complicated sector, obviously, because it's both, I mean, sort of independent, a possibility of going more against the ruling family potentially, but also very much part of the state, right? So it's complicated. But within them, within the youth, I mean, I saw them pick off one by one the most influential youth leaders that were independent in every area, you know, like the economists that were critical, Islamic reformers that were critical, women activists that were critical. Anybody who was this kind of thing were you know, arrested effectively. And then, of course, arresting as well, you know, the people within the ruling family that were a threat, and also the arresting of the business people too. I mean, sending a really strong message to the ruling family. And by the way, that was something that was pretty popular. It's populist thing is important, right? Because the populism does play to some degree to the population, to a broader population. So you're getting a leverage against that. So I think it was a way of like disciplining all of these different potentially competing forces. So I think that was really effective. And at the same time, we had the real shift in power, right? So before Mohammed bin Nayef was replaced, you know, and as crown prince, they had already pulled all of the power out from within the Ministry of Interior and started to centralize it within the royal court. So, you know, I think it was just a very strong plan, all of it grounded in this new nationalism that allowed for the shift. So when you look for resistance, I don't know, I'm kind of struck, and I'd be interested what Greg has to say to this too. I mean, there's no doubt that there's a lot of dissatisfaction. I mean, within the ruling family, unquestionably, there's got to be so many people are getting cut out. I mean, this really is a winnowing of the ruling family. Who's going to have money, power, influence, anything from now on? People are just cut out, right? We can definitely say that within the Islamic sector, there's a lot of dissatisfaction, even in the broader population, especially a real unease with cultural direction. I mean, it's been a very in-your-face cultural shift, right? It hasn't been subtle at all. I mean, when you're talking about bringing Nicki Minaj to Saudi Arabia, that's a huge, that's not like a subtle shift. That's like, we are taking this in a really radical different direction and you can't do anything about it. So we know that there's resentment there. The question is just, you know, they've kind of consolidated the media and the public sphere such that there's no easy way to communicate that in a way that would mobilize people. And that's why I don't think there's a real threat to the direction where they're going. I mean, now we can talk about the economic factors and the things that will really make this whole transition extremely difficult. But on the political level, I think it's kind of hard for me to imagine a broad base from below that could mobilize ruling families that coordinate in a way where they could get a hold of some power leverage, where they could compete. You know, you're left with scenarios thinking of something like assassination or something, but I don't really see, I don't see a coalition that's capable of challenging the basic direction of shift and the transition to MBS.
Okay, Greg, I'd be very interested in hearing what your thoughts are.
So I think Kristin's absolutely right about the family. All sorts of people are being cut out. We know there are even some public indications, much less the private indications we might get when we speak to people in Saudi, that that MBS is not a popular man within the family. He is cutting out basically almost everyone older than he. But he is also cultivating the people his own age and younger. He, of course, is a third generation, a grandson of the founding king of the modern kingdom. I think he's reaching down very much into fourth and fifth generation members of the family who are, again, generationally different than him, but very close to his own age, and trying to develop a constituency within the family among those younger groups. But among people older than he, I don't think he has much support within the family. But as Kristin said, we haven't seen any concerted effort by those forces to try to create blocking coalitions. The last time we had an open fight for power in the Al Saud family was the late 50s and early 60s. And we saw all sorts of things, people leaving the country for periods of time, relatively dramatic shifts in personnel as one side was up and the other side was down. We haven't really seen that. And I think probably the last chance that people of those older generations have in the family to try to block the crown prince would be when the king dies. If I were a betting man, I'd put my money on the fact that they won't be able to get it together. The religious establishment, my reflection on the religious establishment goes back to 9/11 in 2001 and the Al-Qaeda challenge to the Saudi ruling family. It was an indigenous challenge. It was genuinely Saudi. It was genuinely Salafi, that these people were not governing the way the Holy Book said that they should govern. And in that very dramatic period, the vast majority of people in the religious establishment, even people who have been critical of the Al Saud family, rallied to the family, because the vast majority of people in the Salafi movement couldn't imagine a Wahhabi Arabia that wasn't Saudi. And I think that the fact that so many of these people are employees of the state, they're bureaucrats, it's very hard for them to, on their own, mount any kind of challenge to the direction from the top. Now, if there were splits in the family, these people could be mobilized, I believe. But I think everything would have to start with open splits in the family. The business community, I think, is the biggest problem for MBS. And Kristin was certainly right. The Ritz-Carlton Roundup back in 2017 was popular in many quarters of Saudi Arabia, right? These people are finally getting what's coming to them, right? But if you want to shift your economy to a more private sector centered economy, there's a real problem in locking up the private sector. Now, you might say, well, we're going to create a new private sector, an uncorrupt private sector that's not dependent upon the state. But there's the rub, right? Although there have been important changes that have happened in political economy under Vision 2030, the core element of private sector driven growth has not occurred. And the amount of investment from the private sector in Saudi, or either the domestic private sector or the international investors, has not been what Vision 2030 anticipated. And if you are doing things that call into question the security of investment, it's unlikely that you're going to get private sector investment. So I think that treatment of the business community is probably the most difficult thing here. The business community is not going to lead a revolution in Saudi Arabia. They are too dependent on the state. But the problem is you want them to be less dependent on the state. And I don't see that change having occurred yet. When your economic drivers are supposed to be big ticket government projects like NEO, that's not a private sector. That's not a private sector initiative, right? And Saudi Arabia was very successful in building some economic cities, right? At the beginning of of the big oil age of the 70s, right? Jubail and Yanbo were very successful, right? But I think that the experience with economic cities since then has been much more mixed and leaning toward the negative. And I fear that the concentration of the Crown Prince on these big ticket, big state projects runs counter to this ethos of trying to have the private sector be more of a job creator and a job and an economic driver. And with oil prices in a prolonged period of who knows, I can't predict the oil market, but I doubt we're going to see $100 a barrel oil anytime soon. If I could predict the oil market, I wouldn't be doing these webinars, right? I'd be making a ton of money and just, living La Vida Loca. But I can't imagine $100 barrel of oil anytime soon. And so I'm not sure how you get out of these contradictions, right? Wanting to have state-led development and wanting to have a very tight control over your private sector and your political scene, with having a private sector that's going to be independent of the state and the driver of the local economy.
All right. We're going to invite participants in the audience to ask questions now, and I will first we'll open the mic for AGSIW Board Chair Frank Wisner to ask the first question. So, Ambassador Wisner, please.
I think he's still muted.
Gotta unmute yourself, Frank. Welcome to Zoom.
Yes.
Frank,
Raymond, can you help on unmuting Frank?
There we are. I think I finally broke through.
You're present.
My apologies.
Got you.
Fascinating presentation this morning, and thank you both for it. Let me take us back for a second to a point that Greg, you made. And you described, as you mentioned, the new Saudi nationalism, a desire to play a more consequential, more adventurous role in the region. And yet, if you accept that fact and look around at the real reality, reality clashes. The Saudis have clearly found themselves mired in the problems in Yemen. They have seen in recent days the Emiratis break loose and strike out in their own direction and make an overture to Israel. They've seen the Qataris continue to resist Saudi pressure. And if you go beyond that, their ability to manipulate politics in Lebanon has clearly failed. So if there is a desire to affect leadership in the region, Saudi Arabia isn't doing a very good job. How do you think the leadership will take on this MBS and the leadership of Saudi Arabia? How will they move in the future to establish and exercise the regional leadership you mentioned?
Thanks, Frank. I think that the Saudis are pretty good at state-to-state stuff, and they're pretty bad at civil wars. The Iranians are pretty good at civil wars because they have loyal allies. And the problem for the Saudis is they're quote-unquote natural allies. They're the people who are ideologically closest to what we would think of Saudi Arabia, hate the Saudis and want to kill them. And so the Saudis don't have any loyal allies who can play into these civil wars. And since the direction, kind of the geopolitical direction of the region is being played out in these civil wars in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Libya, the Saudis are at a disadvantage. And in that sense, I think that they have to rethink the agenda, right? And I think that there's a real desire to rethink the agenda in Yemen. I think that there's a real desire to get out of Yemen, but nobody is showing them the exit ramp. They can't, I don't think that the leadership thinks it can leave with the Houthis in a position where they can claim victory. But if you're going to have some negotiated settlement in Yemen, the only people who might have any kind of leverage on the Houthis are the Iranians. And right now, right, there's no likelihood that Riyadh and Tehran can talk reasonably about Yemen. I think that probably the most serious positive change that I can see in Saudi foreign policy in the last 5 years has been a more reasonable engagement with Iraq. And I think that down the road, with patience, that will pay dividends in the Saudi effort to roll back Iranian influence in the region. But that requires Iraq to develop more of the attributes of statehood and not be run by militias. And certainly the current prime minister is trying to do that, but the past prime minister tried to do that, and the one before that tried to do that too. And so I'll end on the Arab-Israeli stuff. I'm surprised at how much space in the U.S. the pundits have given to this UAE-Israel thing. It just doesn't seem to change that much to me. And I would revert back to Kristin's generational point about Saudi Arabia. King Salman's generation does not like Israel. They just don't. And while they might live with it because that's the geopolitical reality, they're not going to, as long as the king's alive, I don't think that you're going to see Saudi Arabia have a public relationship with Israel. And to some extent, they don't need it. I think that the UAE's opening to Israel has a lot to do with their standing in Washington. And at some point, the Saudis might see that their standing in Washington requires them to make nice to the Israelis. But I think that will be after King Salman is gone.
Again, just like, I don't really think this is necessarily the way that things will go, but if you wanted to have an optimistic scenario for how the geostrategic thing would shape for the Saudis, and this is an MBS perspective, right? So a younger generation perspective. I mean, you have the Emiratis kind of taking the heat, blazing the trail, going out with these relations with Israel in a way that may allow for some kind of partnerships when they're looking at the broader region. So if you're looking at the Mediterranean, North Africa, or Red Sea, I don't know, I haven't done the, people who know those regions better could work it out better than me, but you can imagine that having some kind of open partnership with Israel could help if you're trying to partner with other states, like France has been very active in the region, and Egypt. Then you have this Egypt, Jordan, okay, and that partnership, I mean, that evolving thing is very much to counter who they now see as their other main competitor, which increasingly these days is not just Iran, which is being a little bit hamstrung, we have to say, to some degree by the maximum pressure campaign, but Turkey. So I think a lot of these states, and especially if we look at the UAE, are looking at Turkey and their ability to influence in the region too. So there's some reshaping with Israel that is allowing for a different kind of partnership there. Then you've got this Egypt, Jordan, Iraq kind of arm that is this interesting kind of separate middle power right now. And I'm kind of on the fence of whether that grouping, and I'd love to hear from other experts and especially from Doug, if they're doing some kind of work too that can help to strengthen a more unified Arab front that would come under this bilateral Saudi Emirati leadership. So this is just kind of sketched out, like that you can see these different moving parts. I think there are huge problems with that, and I have questions about where these different areas are going. But if you wanted to start to recreate kind of an Arab front that would be able to resist, I think the way they look at it, non-Arab challengers in Iran or in Turkey, it would be somehow through these pieces, just put it that way.
Thank you. Let's go to some of the written questions. We've got quite a few of them. First, from our good friend Dave DeRoche. Do the two of you believe that the Democratic Party's opposition to arms sales to the kingdom has more to do with opposition to an initiative by President Trump or deeper-seated concerns about Saudi Arabia? And would you expect a Biden administration to scale back or prevent arms sales as to sort of to make up for the emergency arms authorization that the State Department sent forward last year? So either or both of you, please.
So I think that, yes, the Biden administration will scale back arms sales at the beginning. I would assume that sometime in a Biden administration, there'll be arms sales, but they'll need Republican votes to get that through the Senate. I think that you might not have as solid a Democratic bloc with a Democratic president. You can probably peel off some Democratic senators to vote yes, but you're going to need Republican votes to get any kind of Saudi arms sale through. So a lot of this will depend on whether the Republicans want to play with the Biden administration or whether their position is going to be if Biden's for it or against it. And that was kind of their position under Obama. So we'll see, and we'll see how the Senate goes, obviously. But I think you're going to need Republican votes on anything regarding Saudi. I don't think you can rely on Democratic votes.
Yeah.
Kristin, any comments on that? Or
no, just I think they'll definitely be more willing to kind of leverage that in a way to try to see some shifts in behavior in Saudi Arabia. It's very unclear to me if that would be very successful, but I think there will be a desire to do that, and there'll be real political pressure, I think, below. I've been really struck, you know, when I've gone to the few kind of private political events or something of Democratic senators or congressional people. You know, usually foreign policy is not something that they discuss very much when they're doing their politicking here in the US, and they're not. But the one state that came up was Saudi Arabia, and not in a good way. So it really has become kind of a figurehead for leveraging all that this broader dissatisfaction with the Trump administration and the way that it cozies up, you know, they see to you know, authoritarian or not desirable partners. It's really been consolidated in this idea of Saudi Arabia and the relationship there. I've been kind of struck by that. So I think there will be some real pressure from the Democrats to at least you know, show that and demonstrate it in some ways. And I think arms sales is the most obvious area. And Yemen, so we could talk about Yemen.
Well, let me ask, there's a corollary question from Richard LeBaron, which is essentially, would a deeper understanding of the internal dynamics of Saudi Arabia by U.S. policymakers and influencers necessarily lead to better U.S. policy, or could it be possible that that could make things worse or more difficult? An interesting question. Greg, you're laughing, so I'll let you take that first.
So I'm an academic, so I have to say, of course, if we knew more about these countries, our policies would be better. In my heart of hearts, I truly don't believe that. I think one of the big problems in American politics is we want to change everybody's domestic politics to look more like ours because ours is so good. One can question whether ours is so good these days. One can also question whether a foreign policy that's based, whether you're a neocon or a liberal or interventionist, is based upon restructuring the domestic politics of other parts of the world is the most effective way for America to secure its interests. And so I am very leery of any approach that says we should use our international leverage to get these people to change their domestic political systems. Whether that's a human rights agenda, whether it's a democracy agenda, whether it's any kind of agenda. I think that we have to understand that when you start messing, and you would think that our adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan might have taught us this lesson, but I don't think that everyone in Washington has learned that lesson. That when you make changing the domestic politics of a country the fulcrum of your foreign policy approach, you're doomed to failure.
I mean, that being said, I mean, it's one thing to say changing the domestic politics. It's another to say to build broad international coalitions with your allies over particular values and policy orientations. And I don't think it's problematic for the US that has based itself as a strong supporter of, more democratic systems and more liberal markets. We can talk about all the problematics with that are shifting. I mean, obviously that's not really what we're championing right now. But I think if we go back and traditionally think about that, it's not a bad thing for, to leverage your relationships around those kinds of values in a more general sense.
Right. I'm going to kind of paraphrase a relatively dark question from Karen Young on economics. She essentially says the Saudis are not going to get out of this. It's a fiscal cliff. The question is, how will Saudi society will change in the next decade when it becomes poorer, chronically unemployed and underemployed, its reserves dwindle, and the government is reliant on a pattern of borrowing and raising taxes to sustain itself? I mean, if Saudi Arabia drops out of the G20, how will that affect their international relations? Who will continue to be a friend and ally of Saudi Arabia? A lot packaged into that question, but as I said, it's a very interesting and dark economic assumption up front. So I'll let whichever of you is interested to take that on, go ahead.
Well, I mean, we have glimmers of this already. Well, first of all, the Saudis are trying to lead the G20 right now. They're leading the G20, and they're trying to get even stronger roles in the WTO. So they're trying to play in these international organizations, and that's part of their image of they should be leaders and having a say. And actually, they are having kind of a say these days. So there's that on the international level. But I think we want to see what's happening inside. I mean, we can already see images of this, right? I mean, what have they done in this crisis? They've tripled the VAT. I mean, that hit Saudis immediately. They've cut back on the salary, additional benefits that people get with their salaries, which are significant. They're not insignificant. Saudis are now investing in Aramco. I mean, the whole thing, like they were supposed to put this on an international, put the Aramco cell privatization on international markets and get international capital, all this kind of stuff. I mean, they ended up getting Saudi capital. They got Saudis to invest in Aramco. I mean, that was one of the big elements of it. I mean, when I talked to the former Minister of Education, he said they're working to, decentralize the universities a bit with a look towards future charging tuition. So, I mean, I think all of these things are on the table, and obviously they're shutting off a lot more of the job sectors to foreigners, and that's another big picture that we're going to have about the role of expatriates and Saudis taking those positions, with an expectations that Saudis will take over in a lot of these different fields. So I think, if you're a Saudi citizen, that's what you can see in your future, is that you're going to be paying for a lot more of the Saudi state, a lot more of your situation, and in effect you will be poorer. I think the hope obviously is that this is generating some new dynamic where you have a diversification of the market, and but the problem is all of that still relies on getting the international investment. And we should bring Karen to talk about that, because I'm definitely not going to talk to Karen Young about where the economy isn't going in Saudi Arabia, because I know she knows the details of these things much more than I do. But I think she's right about the general direction. That's where it's going.
Well, Greg, I wanted you to answer the same question, because you started out by saying the United States may be overestimating its own energy independence line, implying that Saudi Arabia will continue to be more important in international oil markets and economically in the future. So how do you react to Karen's very dark characterization of the future of the Saudi economy?
Well, they call economics the dismal science, and so economists have to be a little dark. Karen's absolutely right about the straight line projections here, right? But what we know is that in the Middle East, and basically anywhere, very rarely do the straight lines keep running out. I think that the biggest convulsion in the short term in the Saudi economy is the departure of 2 million foreign workers from Saudi Arabia, something in those numbers in the last 4 or 5 years. That depresses the local economy, but it also, and so it's wrenching, but it also might be the opening through which you can finally get Saudis into private sector jobs, right? They would love to have public sector jobs. We know that, but it's going to be convulsive. And I guess the big question is, can you keep the political situation together, and can you maintain the political will to kind of drive these economic convulsions in a direction that you like? And here's where the Saudi private sector and its relationship to the state, I think, is going to be key. Let me talk a little bit about oil, right? The last drop of economically viable oil that's sold on the world market is going to come from Saudi Arabia, right? Because they really do have the cheapest cost of production. But we don't know how long the oil era is going to last, right? I think it was Sheikh Imani who said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. As long as there is a world demand for oil, Saudi Arabia is going to be important. And we saw that, as Kristin alluded to earlier in the hour, the Saudis basically brought down the price of oil at the beginning of COVID because they didn't think the Russians were playing ball with them. And when they sweated the Russians, and the Russians came back and said, okay, we'll accept production cuts, the Saudis could orchestrate, right, an OPEC, non-OPEC deal to limit oil production and try to prop up prices. They are still the actors in the world oil market. But things beyond their control, I think, will determine whether that world oil market is around $40 a barrel, around $70 a barrel, or around $20 a barrel. And that's what the Saudis can't control in the long term. And that's why they have to think about what's going to happen when oil is just not as valuable a commodity as it has been.
Let me completely change directions with a question from Tom Pickering, another member of the AGSIW board. He says that there are allegations that the Saudis have significantly funded Trump, and that you saw some of that with Trump's initial trip to Saudi Arabia and some that things he has done since then. How much can you dismiss or credit these points as a reason for the direction of U.S. foreign policy with Saudi Arabia? It's an easy question.
Kristin, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know. I don't have any concrete information about that. It's very clear that very close ties and very personalized ties were made very early, and that those have been really significant in the relationship. I don't know if those are, what are the Greece building those things? There's plenty of leverage that can be applied there, and interest the state, through the American state and the policies that we're doing that are advantageous, and vice versa. But I don't have any information about that. But there's no question, I think, that the ties were very personalized very early on, and that has been a key element of the relationship.
Yeah, I don't have any information on this either. Who knows? President Trump thinks of foreign policy as personal relationships with individuals. Right? If you have a good personal relationship with Kim Jong-un, you can get good results on North Korea. If you have a good personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, you can get good results in Russia. If you have a good personal relationship with MBS, you can get good results in Saudi Arabia. Now, what those good results are they personal? Are they familial for the Trump family? Are they for the country? I think is something that I just don't have enough information to make a judgment about. It is absolutely clear that the Trump administration played into the politics of the ruling family in Saudi Arabia in a way that I think is really unprecedented in American politics. You might be able to go back to the Kennedy administration and the Saud Faisal conflict. The Kennedy administration, I think, did lean toward who was then Crown Prince Faisal. But it's no accident that Mohammed bin Nayef was turfed out as Crown Prince, not in the Obama administration, but in very soon after the Trump administration came to power. Right? We have to remember that Prince Mohammed bin Nayef was, for two American administrations, right, for the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration, Washington's favorite Saudi. And the Trump administration was relatively open about its preference for MBS and bragged about it when MBS became Crown Prince. I thought that was I thought it was bad policy, and I thought it was bad politics. And it's unfortunate because I think it has contributed to the increasing partisan view in the United States of relations with Saudi Arabia. So is there money under the table to the Trump campaign, to the Trump family? I don't know. Tom, do you know? But there is this personalization that I think is, long term, it's negative. We should have relations with states, not people.
Right. This, I'm conscious of the time of all our discussants and participants, so this may be the last question, but it's an interesting one from Ariel Gold, who argues that the gains for Saudi women won't have a real impact in improving women's lives until the basic premise that women need a male sponsor is completely done away with. So are there pressure points on Saudi Arabia to get rid of the guardianship system or the kafala system? And what role do you think a generational change and Saudi youth might have in moving in that direction? I'll let either of you tackle that one.
Yeah, I mean, they have really been substantially shifting elements of the guardianship system. I mean, whether it be through, issues about women driving, women traveling abroad, women being able to represent themselves to some degree in court and with their families. Those things have been changing. And the guardianship system is not like one thing, right? It's a web of things that they have to transition over time. I think the bigger question, though, is, I mean, obviously they've done what have been really substantially broadened the participation for women in the public life and in the economy, but they've done it while really hamstringing, any voice of independent activist women, I mean, jailing them. And it kind of leaves me a question long term, where are the voices that will allow for a deeper way to communicate where these things are failing? Because a lot of times, a lot of these things, while they're substantial, they're also a lot kind of shifted towards an international audience too, but where you see trying to make these real changes, not just in the laws, but in how they're being applied. You really need some strong voices to show where those gaps are and to build kind of a domestic participation and support behind that. And that kind of is what worries me, where they're falling short on those things.
Greg, let me add one more question to this list and then give you the last word for the presentation. This is from Deborah Jones, asking about the case of Saad al-Jabri and both his very public approach and whether or not average Saudis see him as the national security threat that he's being made out by the government. Is his strategy an effective one?
I doubt many Saudis know who Saad al-Jabri is. He was an insider. He wasn't like Jamal Khashoggi. He wasn't a public figure. He wasn't a writer. He wasn't somebody who was on TV. I think that he's well known in elite circles in the United States, and that's his appeal is on elite circles in the United States. And I think that in that sense, he's probably got a little bit more leverage internationally than he would domestically in Saudi Arabia itself. Kristin follows the social media in Saudi Arabia much closer than I do because I'm old. But Kristin, do you notice anything about Saad al-Jabri's?
Yeah, I mean, they worked up a defense around that issue because they have the storyline that he absconded with a lot of money, which is the argument. I mean, I don't know the details of this and how much to credit them how much this was actually part of his policies, or how much this is a part of the whole system, the way that it worked in Saudi Arabia. But definitely the argument that they're making right now is that he absconded with a lot of money. He's wanted back for prosecution on these, you know, basically embezzlement charges. And they're actually stirring up a lot of kind of populism around that issue. So this is where the kind of populist element of the nationalism becomes really strong and can be mobilized.
Well, Greg and Kristin, I want to say thank you very much for participating in this morning's program. We've run out of time, and I want to make sure that everybody can get on to the rest of their days. But I want to thank everybody who tuned in on Zoom to hear this. And the video of this should be up on the AGSIW website, agsiw.org, in a day or two. So you can go back and pick apart what we have said and reframe your questions in hindsight if you wish. So have a good day, everybody. Stay safe. Bye-bye.